Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America, and today I'm joined by my colleague, James Kim, Director of External Relations and Public Opinion here at KEI. Today we are talking about a new report that he has authored along with our colleague Niels on American attitudes toward trade and investment, a special survey that we conducted together with YouGov. And James, first, why don't you just tell us what the methodology around this report was and what we were trying to get at, and then tell us what you think some of the main takeaways are.
Right. So we didn't want to do a regular national level survey, largely because we wanted to know if there were any local level differences on American attitudes about investments and trade, depending on sort of very unique characteristics of those localities. So there were two things that we looked at. One was the amount of greenbelt investments coming in from South Korea into these states, controlled by population size, and then the visibility of Korean investments, which could be affected by certain kinds of proxies or cues that people would use to make inferences about that. So things like, whether you have Korean supermarkets or Korean small businesses, and that is typically a function of the number of Korean American population in that state. So we try to look at the state level, those states where Korean American population was high versus low, and contrast that also and combine that with this view about amount of Korean investments coming in, whether that's high or low. And we looked at 10 states where there are variabilities along those lines. So, in states like Georgia and Texas where it's high on both ends. There are certain states like Arkansas and Wisconsin where it's very, very low on both ends on investments and Korean American population. And then there are about, six other states that vary along two other dimensions. We took an equal sample from each of those states. We tried to get
200 people from each state.
That's right, 200 people or so, and their representative sample weighted to the state level population characteristics. We also looked at things like certain kinds of demographic factors, gender, age, education level, and political affiliation, to kind of get a representative sample that represents that state. So we had state-level representation for 10 states that were spread out along those two dimensions. And we try to see if there were any local differences that we could find there at the state level. And then, broadly for those 10 states, how they measured up against other national level surveys that we've seen. And what we found, interestingly enough, is that a lot of the national level findings actually apply to these 10 states in the aggregate. So that speaks a little to the amount of work that went in by YouGov, who is our partner in this for the field work. They did a really good job of finding a sample that's not only representative of these states, 10 states, but even though it's a subset of the whole nation, it is representative of the national level sample as well. So this was a very interesting survey for us. And I think the main takeaway that we found that was very important and that surprised us was that we didn't see as big of a difference. There were differences across states, obviously, but the differences were not as large as we had thought when it came down to questions of investments in trade, like how Americans saw foreign investments, whether they saw it favorably or not favorably, whether they would like to see more or less, whether they thought that its impact on jobs and the economy was good or bad. We didn't see huge differences. There were some minor differences, and it was suggestive. Where the investments were higher, yeah, it was definitely more favorable, but it wasn't to the extent where this was a statistically significant, a break between, let's say, Georgia and New York, or Texas and Washington State. So instead, what we found was perceptions about investments based on visible cues, along with the amount of investments that had some impact, and these impacts were sizable enough, sometimes as much as 2x difference in favorability on foreign investments and its impact on the economy, that we thought that this is a very important factor that needs to be brought out into the open and discussed. So we highlighted that. There were some partisan differences we saw, and then some demographic differences that we highlighted as well. That was worth thinking about. But overall, the most important takeaway was that perceptions mattered. Country of origin also seemed to have mattered a bit. Who invests, or who do we trade with? The third thing is, along partisan line, who you are as an individual, politically speaking, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, seem to have made some differences. And these are some of the main takeaways from the report that I would draw your attention to.
Okay, and we'll dig into each of those, but I also just want to mention that the report is available on our website at keia.org. So the main takeaway is that perception is the most important derivative of that investment rather than size, as we look at that particular set of issues, the other thing that stood out to me was that actually Korean invested states were places where respondents also had more positive views of foreign investment in general, which is a little bit of a just a correlation, I guess, not necessarily a causation. But I think that was also notable. This survey, it covered 200 people in each of 10 states along the framework that you outlined. And I know that you also dug into issues related to origin of investment quite a bit. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit about what you learned about American perceptions as related to where the investment is coming from in terms of favorability.
So let me step back for a moment and go back to what you had said earlier. There could be a relationship between the amount of investment and visibility of those investments, right? Obviously, if the size of the investment is very, very large, then visibility is just going to come with the territory, right? You're just going to have more Korean Americans coming into that community, being employed by these companies, or you have other Korean nationals coming in on special visas, so they're going to be more visible. So at a certain point, size will start to matter, I would argue. But under current levels, it's just not quite there yet in terms of relative size. So if you continue to increase the amount of investment in that community, and it will increase. I mean, I think U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis data from 23. I haven't seen the data updated to 24 yet. For 23 was I think 6.7 billion came in from Korea out of about 230 billion that came in that year globally. The net accumulative foreign investments was over $5 trillion. And for Korea, net cumulative is $78 billion. So this number over time, as it continues to increase, and, we just saw Hyundai make an announcement for $21 billion investment into the U.S. It's 3x, 4x larger than what it was in 23, just for that one company alone. So we'll have to see what, how that $21 billion is spread out over X number of years. But still, as this number builds, I think the impact is going to be there. So having said that, on this second question about origin, and there's a lot of research that seems to suggest the connection between who you trade with versus who you don't trade with. So on data related to trade, there's a lot of public opinion data that's Chicago Council for Global Affairs has done some really good work in that area, along with Pew Research Center, that seem to show that Americans have a relatively unfavorable view about trade with China. Though sometimes, that could come up and down depending on the current events and the situation between the two countries. But overall, though, relatively speaking, Americans do not have a favorable view about trade with China. And we wanted to see if there was anything that can be said about investments with China. And one of the questions that we asked was, what do you think about the economic impact of investments coming in from China versus, let's say, unnamed foreign country versus Japan or Korea? And what we found was that there was a sizable difference, right? And the difference was quite large. I mean, on China, the favorability was only about 30, 35, 38%, 39%. And Japan, it was 64% favorability on inbound investments from Japan. That's a 25 percentage point difference. For Korea, it was about 56% favorability on Korean investments. That's a 16 to 17% difference versus the Chinese. So Americans do care, it seems to me, about who is investing in their community. And that may have something to do with a lot of the media framing about this issue, about the national security implications of these investments, whether or not these investments are going to be some kind of a leverage that China can use against the U.S. It seems to me that until that framing, as long as we have that framing about the great power competition with China, this view that the American public has about who invests in their community, it's not going to change. And we, by the way, tried this generally for all kinds of investments, and then for investments on things like technology. And there, we didn't see much of a difference. I mean, we saw maybe about 4 or 5 percentage point differences across the board. But they were a bit more favorable about China's technology investments coming in, interestingly enough, more so than they were about other kinds of Chinese investments. So the difference was about, for generic Chinese investments, 39%. Support for technology investments coming in from China at 46%. So Americans seem to think that, if it's a good quality job, I might consider this. But still, it's not to the extent that they would support investments on technology jobs coming in from Japan or Korea, okay, which is still about 15 to 20% more greater than it is to China. So what that means again is that who invests in our community matters.
Now, this survey was conducted last December, and at that point, I think certainly those surveyed knew that tariffs was going to be a big issue, but maybe it hadn't hit home in the way that it does now. What does the survey results say about American attitudes toward tariffs as a component of trade policy?
So generally, when we asked about trade and tariff, Americans, at least for the 10 states that we looked at, which seemed to me quite representative of other national surveys that we've had. There, what you saw is 74% support for trade more open trade, increased trade, if not same amount of trade, versus on tariff, only about 25% or so supporting increasing tariff. Good 60% or so want to either keep the same level of tariff or lower it. This is before the April announcements. So generally speaking, it seems to me that Americans favor open trade, and this is in line with what we've seen in other surveys that have already come out on this issue. And so that generally lines up. But interestingly enough, the percentage on tariff wasn't a zero. It's still 1 in 4 Americans still support tariff, even though there's a quite sizable.
So in this survey, was there any breakdown along partisan lines as related to perceptions of trade and tariffs?
Yeah, so that's where the interesting differences came in, right? So where does that 25% come in? Who are these people that support increasing tariffs? And there we saw a very important break along partisan lines and along ideological lines. So if you were to look at where liberals stood, so self-identifying liberals stood on issues having to do with trade, 47% want increased trade versus conservatives, 37%. So that's about a 10 percentage point difference. On tariff, only about 8.5% of liberals support increasing tariff, as opposed to conservatives, over 50% support increasing tariff. Along partisan lines, Democrats, 43% support increasing trade. Republicans, interestingly, 37%. 5 percentage point difference might not be huge, you could say, within margin of error. Democrats on tariffs, only 11% support for the Republicans, 49%. So it seems as though 1 in 2 Republicans, 1 in 2 conservatives want high tariffs. Plurality also support open and increased trade. So there's a disconnect along partisan lines. It seems that the Republican line is somewhat, similar to the president's position or the administration's position. We want to continue to export our goods, but we want to keep these tariffs on for our own reasons, for national security reasons, for jobs, among other things.
Okay, another finding that caught my eye is related to reciprocity, which has been a word in the news related to trade, but the results really shined a light on reciprocity and investment. And so I wonder if you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, so the way that we tried to kind of get at this question of reciprocity was by asking 2 questions. Where do you stand on restrictions for investments coming into the U.S.? Where do you stand on restrictions on American companies investing in other countries? So what we found, interestingly enough, is that 20% of the population that we looked at generally favor lowering restrictions in both coming in and going out. And then there was another 16% that wanted the restrictions to stay in place, but going out, they want that restrictions gone. So generally speaking, about 36% would like to have U.S. continue to be able to invest outwardly, but only about 20% want this kind of a reciprocal scenario where all restrictions are gone. So it seems to me that 36%, even though they would like to have continued U.S. Outbound investment, on the inbound investment, they want some kind of control on the inbound investment. And so on reciprocity, it's not a pure two-way street where everything's open for both sides to do everything they want on investments. On trade, it's very clear that even though generally speaking people want increase trade, and generally, 3 out of 4 want lower tariffs along partisan lines. That's also very different, right? So we didn't see the partisan differences on the investment question, though. Interestingly, we saw it more with respect to trade, because it seems as though the popular media hasn't really framed it this way for investments. Like, the president hasn't really made everything into an investment issue. Investment is part of a broader sort of debate about trade and tariffs at the moment, right? It's not a separate issue that he just talks about just on investments and what kinds of restrictions there are to outbound investments and inbound investments. That discussion isn't happening in the popular media. And where the media framing comes in is that on the question of tariffs, investment is sort of attached to that particular issue. Say, if you want to address the tariff problem and the trade imbalance, invest more into the U.S., right? So there's an issue linkage between the two, but we don't have a separate framing on investments. Probably explains why we didn't see a partisan difference there.
Okay. Another significant aspect of the U.S.-Korea trade and investment relationship is cooperation around advanced technologies. How would you describe American preferences regarding approach to either sharing technology through joint ventures or technology denial as related to protection of the U.S. defense industrial base?
So on defense industrial cooperation, this is an issue that is being talked about a lot when it comes to looking at sort of the formulation of the alliance. How do we take the alliance to the next level under the Trump 2.0 era? And one of the discussions that keeps coming up is greater industrial cooperation. And there, we wanted to see where the public stood on that issue. Do you want more restrictions on defense industrial cooperation or less restrictions on industrial cooperation? And only about 18% supported less restrictions on industrial cooperation. Only about 18% wanted to increase restrictions on industrial cooperation, and a good 40% or so wanted to maintain the current level of restriction. So that's over 50%, nearly 60% saying we either want to maintain the current restrictions on defense industrial cooperation or to increase it. And only a very small, like 2%, 3% wanted to decrease defense industrial cooperation. So it seems to me that for the public, this issue about national security concerns having to do with technology transfer on defense industrial cooperation is an issue that's going to need to be worked out. Or if the president decides to push ahead on defense industrial cooperation without explaining this to the American public, either the Democrats or some other elements can reframe this issue as a very big mistake from a national security point of view. And so some kind of a framing or reframing needs to be done here by the administration to be able to convince and persuade the American public that this is something that is necessary for the U.S. But that's only on domestic politics, and that probably comes into play more during the election cycles that we'll be heading, in about a year, if not 2 years after that, depending on the timing of the rollout of these kinds of announcements.
Okay. Well, that's all the time that we have for today, and I think we've really only scratched the surface in terms of what is in the report from our investment survey that KEI conducted. It is located on our website, keia.org, and I would encourage people to check out the entire report, which should also be available in our show notes. And so thanks, James, for telling us a little bit about the report, and thank you for joining us on Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.